and welcome to Preparing Your Comms for Controversy with the PRCA's charity and non-profit group. I'm Paige Patrick, Digital Media and Marketing Manager for Resuscitation Council UK. I'm co-chairing this event with Dr. Nikki Garston, Associate Professor of Communications at the University of Greenwich and co-editor of Communicating Causes, Strategic Public Relations in the Not-for-Profit Sector. We're delighted to be welcoming you all to this event today. A reminder that if you are a PRC member, you get 10 CPD points for this. But we're really excited about our speaker, Sho Walker-Konno. Sho is a communications coach for activists, currently supporting under fire activists worldwide, from abortion to trans rights to climate justice and migration. He's got a really great session lined up, so please do get involved and share your thoughts and opinions. If you're able to, we'd love to have those cameras on so that Sho's not feeling like he's just talking to blank screens. I know it can feel a bit like, oh, but trust me, like it makes for a better session. If you've got any like technical issues or anything, pop it in the chat and we'll take a look. But over to you, Sho.
Thanks very much, Paige. And of course, understand that for some people, yeah, you're in situations where you can't have your camera on, but the more of you that can, the easier it is for me to have some human feedback and also see whether there's bored or confused faces to know to adjust what I'm saying. Brilliant. So I'll quickly share my screen. I'll try not to have too much slide deck here. I'm Sho. I'm a communications coach for activists, and Paige introduced some of the people that I work for. What that means for the sake of today is that I'm mainly going to be talking about comms, obviously, like the kinds of crises or controversies that we're dealing with. They obviously have to be integrated with your community work, your private advocacy and lobbying, your legal strategy, and your grassroots services. But today we're just going to focus on stuff. What do you say externally? I'm going to try and keep it UK focused. Well, obviously, I'm going to try and like talk about your UK issues that you're facing. I'm actually based in Amsterdam, but you probably can tell that I didn't always grow up here. And I'm going to try and bring some examples from the rest of the world, from activists I work with too. And I'm also a trustee for a small migrants charity in London. So I'm going to try and bring some of that perspective as well, on the kind of the perspective on risks and sign off and stuff like that, which is often quite important. So yeah, thanks to those of you who turned on your camera so I can see some humans. I'd like to quickly get, thanks to those of you who introduced you and told me who you work for, where you are. I'd like to just quickly get a sense of why you're here. And to reiterate again, A, this stuff will be in the chat box, and B, if anything gets uploaded from the recording, these bits will be edited out. But yeah, I'd be interested to know why you're here. Like, why have you turned up to a session entitled Preparing Your Comms for Controversy? That will already help me a little bit in what to focus on today. So maybe, yeah, if it's possible, people could quickly just type into the chat box so I can so I can see that while I tell you a rough loadout of what we're going to cover today. Just to be clear, yeah, people are typing into the chat box. Brilliant, thank you. While you're typing that in, I'll just let you know, like you hopefully saw in the invite, we're sort of talking about coping with controversy, dealing with disinformation, and strength and solidarity, because we love alliteration. And I'm gonna sort of like try and do it a bit step by step today, via some examples from other activists I've worked with, through a kind of a to-do list of relatively low-lift things you could do at each kind of classic stage of preparing your comms for controversy. So in preparation, monitoring, diagnosis, and response. So to hopefully leave you with a little bit of like things you could do, things you could action after today to help you feel more prepared. And again, just to sort of say what this session is and what it isn't, just a kind of bit of definition. we'll be dealing a fair bit with misinformation, so content that's false, misleading, but is a bit different from disinformation, which is deliberately, like intentionally false or misleading content shared with an intent to harm today. But we won't really be dealing with malinformation. And I really like this sort of Venn diagram for being a bit more specific about what these things, the difference between these things. These are things more like getting dots or cybersecurity or things like that, just because that sort of stretches a bit beyond comms. I know it's important, but just to sort of like set your expectations for what we won't go with. And brilliant. Thank you to the three of you who, four of you who have told me what it is, the reason why you're here. Some of you are used to dealing with controversy, thinking about contingencies, and for example, what about being attacked for taking position on the latest Middle East situation? That is absolutely something which I'm going to talk about because I'm in the middle of that at the moment as well. And I'm also not to try and make it. Oh, sorry. The audio is still on that video. I'm also not going to directly talk about kind of general crisis comms management today. Kind of like your charity actually did do something wrong. Your volunteer was naughty, or your finance director got caught with their hand in the till. Or something like COVID happened and there's been a huge external event and you need to communicate about that crisis with your people. Because today we're more specifically dealing on kind of like opposition generated controversy. And also because there are other good resources on this. And here are three I'd recommend: the Spitfire Smart Plan for crisis comms, the Charity Comms Crisis Communications for Charities, which is more specifically for UK people, but it's a few years out of date now. And a sort of like a joint session I did with some LGBTI activists on how to do crisis comms during COVID specifically, which has a few other resources in it as well. And again, just to reassure people, because people always ask this, yes, these slides and all of the links within them will be shared with you afterwards, and actually also in the chat box at the end. Okay, so these are two probably highest profile, I'd say, examples of UK charities dealing with comms controversies in the last year. If you think there's others that are similarly like blockbuster, I'd like to hear about them in the chat box. Oh, and thank you also for this contribution about being ill prepared for crisis comms. So yeah, so on the left, it's when Mind, the mental health charity, talked about Chris Kaba and the issues of racism dealing with police. And on the right, when Friends of the Earth, or when RSPB England did the Liars post about the government's environmental protection legislation. And in both cases, to some extent, had to walk it back. And definitely generated a lot of flack for it. Of course, it's partly because of the higher profile of these charities, although I actually see that a couple of you, it's interesting actually, a couple of you are from sort of like what you might think of as higher profile, higher, bigger target organizations, a couple of you from smaller organizations maybe. But the thing I'd warn is just, if you think that a similar controversy couldn't happen to you, or maybe more accurately, a similar controversy couldn't be generated against you, I would say don't be naive. Like this could happen to any of us. It's just it was a bigger deal because it was Mind and RSPB. And I'd also say I'm not sort of like being wise after the fact and saying that there was a really obvious correct way to handle this better than those teams. And actually did a session on this with some of the people from Mind where I got some interesting reflections from them. But let's go through some steps that hopefully might help you if you were to face something like this. Now, this is where we're going to see whether the Zoom poll that we tried to set up in advance works. Kiri, if you're on the button. So I wanted to suggest 4 of the most common scenarios that I found activists and campaigners come up against, and I'd love you to just vote which one or more than one are most relevant to you, just so it's helpful to focus on. So, constant online harassment of our platforms by trolls maybe or others. A journalist inquiry from someone, a journalist or a media outlet with a history of misleading stories, and if that's the thing that's sort of stressing you out, um, whether your volunteers and staff are feeling overwhelmed by this controversy, and so you're finding that you're actually having like an internal problem, or that their sort of like ability to have conversations with people about the issue is limited, and they're overwhelmed by it, or whether it's that controversy is scaring your colleagues or maybe your management or trustees from doing comms on these topics in the first place. So yes, you should be able to see a poll up in front of you at the moment. It'd be great if you could vote for which, or if there are more than one, vote for more than one that are most sort of like priority or relevant to you. And if there are none, or if there's one of something completely different, I'd like to hear about that in the chat box as well. I registered that someone's already mentioned the it only lets you vote for one choice. Okay, then just vote for the one that's the most relevant to you. Thanks for flagging that. Kiri, I don't know if you can see, but if you can see that like a handful of people have voted, maybe you can show us the results.
Yeah, so there is 8 people that have submitted their votes, so I can end the poll now, and then you should be able to see the results.
Thank you. So online harassment was the main one, but actually journalist and controversy scaring people was not too far behind. We'll still, just because someone has voted for it, we'll still make sure to mention to cover that volunteers one, but it's good to know that that's where we should be focusing on. This is also just quite interesting. I've done this session a couple of times with other groups, and so it's also useful for me to get a kind of straw poll of where the anxiety is in the sector. Sorry. Okay, so it's worth, when we come to the preparation phase, checking on time, yeah, it's worth putting our finger on why it is a problem when you're being attacked or when you're in the storm of controversy, whether it's deliberate disinformation and opposition to you, or whether it's just criticism that's a bit more organic and out there. And this is important because I think like being able to identify what the impact of controversy on you and just write it down and categorize it is sometimes one of the first steps to feeling better about it. And I think that it can be an individual impact. Being lied about or being critiqued for your work hurts, especially when you work somewhere for purpose, especially if you say volunteer on an issue. Organizationally, there's an impact, and these could be the really big bad impacts. So you lose funding, you get sued in court, you have a serious loss of credibility for your organization. But I wouldn't underestimate the kind of more everyday impacts of controversy, which is just kind of like the mental load on your internal team of having to talk about it in every meeting and having to second guess yourself every time you do a tweet. So the kind of wasting your time impact is an important thing to kind of like give an equal weighting to the really, really worst case scenarios as well. And then there's strategic impact. There's a sort of specific impact damaging our campaigning and comms objectives, whatever cause you work for. But there's also just our side. I would loosely categorize our side as being people who care about social change. Our side loses out from a general climate of distrust and apathy and cynicism about truth, more than the people who want to keep things the way they are. And so it's we're an asymmetric disadvantage when things like disinformation take hold. So a couple of simple things we can do about it, and I'll come back to the actual main one, or I think the most interesting one. But one boring process one is just as communications should be in your organizational strategy, communications risks should be in your organizational risk assessment and mitigation process. I'm showing you on screen the very useful NCVO template for risk register, which I think has a tab on external risk. And I hope I've anonymized enough this example I'm showing you, but you can see that for a migration charity, this is some of our some of the risks that we've categorized. And I think it's just a really useful process. We literally did this last week on our trustee board with the staff again. And it's really useful to, for example, this year to check, hey, all those risks that we thought we'd identified, how did they stack up during the COVID pandemic? And then do we think that our processes are fit for purpose now? And it's possible to get a bit too obsessed with the whole scoring aspect of these risk registers. The point is that you just have a conversation about it. How likely are they? If they did happen, sorry, how likely are they to happen? If they did happen, what would be the impact of that? And just having that conversation and thinking, how well set up are we for it now? What kind of mitigation would we do? This might be super obvious to those of you who are already involved in more like the operational side of your organization, but it's something that is staggering how few comms people and how disconnected the comms risks are to organizational risk management, I find. Super boring, but super important process tip. It also really covers you in case you get one of those, in case later you get one of those worst case scenarios where you've got board members getting involved or charity commission getting involved. This is one of the processes that can really, give a great paper trail for you. But it's also just actually really practically useful, I've found. So I think I've seen one example where, yes, the individual opinions of people who shouldn't really be a situation with two sides, but where people have tried to make it a situation of two sides, have influenced whether the charity is making a statement or not, and what the wording is of that statement. And that's kind of exploded internally because it's meant that it's purely come down to the relative power in the hierarchy of which individual holds that opinion in one organization that I've heard of. And in the organization that I'm a part of, I've been advising them on is it enough to make a statement on it just because the people in your charity feel very strongly about it and are quite clear that one approach to a statement is the right thing to do. But because of the kind of regulations that most charities will be having to deal with in the UK, do you need to be a bit careful in being able to show always the link to the charitable mission? So to be really clear, like, we're not saying this because this is our opinion on why there needs to be a ceasefire. We're saying this because we can see the impact of rising Islamophobia, rising anti-Semitism on our communities in here. And that's why we're speaking out on it, and being able to link that directly is something that covers you a bit more when it comes to the regulation. And also, I think, in response to criticism of why did you make that statement? So those are the two examples I'm trying to grapple with. I'm not trying to be glib here, but I would think that actually if this process had been done in advance, and I think this applies to us as well, the charity that I've done this risk register comes from. I think we had a risk actually that was something like external topic comes up that divides student and staff, and what are the processes about how we go about that, both the kind of discussion guide internally and service users and stuff, versus what we say externally. If we'd had that risk a bit more discussed in advance, maybe when the Ukraine invasion had happened and it was a potentially slightly more straightforward thing to make a statement about, maybe we would be better prepared now. I certainly think that's the case for the organization I mentioned, where you've got a case of just individual opinions on the hierarchy influencing what that statement is. So yeah, don't know if that helps or not, but those are two anyway, sympathies, because those are two organizations I know that are going through a similar dilemma. Second phase of monitoring. Monitoring helps you spot the patterns of potential controversy coming your way, and it also helps organize your response or non-response. This is a kind of slide I designed more for small organizations. Large organizations will tend to have monitoring systems set up. But I've just given the examples here. You can see on the screen, it's CrowdTangle, but there's also Google Alerts and TweetDeck of free tools that at least let you sort of search for keywords that are coming up that might be relevant to you. And again, here it's not really about the tech. It's more about the process of having a discussion with your colleagues about what keywords you should be looking out for, which is the useful preparation exercise. having that meeting is the thing that will help prepare you more than the actual fancy tech platform that you might use and eventually probably get bullied into paying money for. Even for those of you who have monitoring systems set up, though, it's good to think about, test yourself. Would they actually warn you about likely avenues of opposition-generated controversy, as opposed to just controversy that has already come to your shores, that already mentions your organization or mentions obvious things? Would it give you an early warning, so to speak? Two examples I've heard are one group in Macedonia I worked with used to have what they call silent observers who would sit in opposition kind of favorite Facebook groups of the opposition. In their case, it'd be kind of like parents' rights groups, or kind of even like parent content sharing, parent life hack Facebook groups, because then they could see in advance the kind of the opposition to sex and relationship education that was coming at them. And I think it was mine themselves, when I did this session last year, said that they actually had a heads up on police groups organizing against them, or at least organizing, sharing content that was directed at mine in response to their Chris Cabba post, because they had people who were a bit more sort of like in touch with those kind of networks. So I think that's always think, don't just rely on these tech platforms, but think about who are your human resources that give you that early warning system. But I put here, do you have a sustainable monitoring system is the kind of the to-do list here, because it's got to be something that you actually can keep up. If it's something that just chucks a million emails at you a week and so you end up ignoring it, then it's worse than not having anything at all, I think, because it's adding stress but no value. As is any process, having some kind of human check-in moment once a day or once a week as part of your routine is the most likely way you're going to keep this up. And I remember someone voted for the kind of volunteers being overwhelmed option. So I just want to share this example from Ireland, which is to make the point that sustainable also means you're looking after the well-being, the welfare of the people who are doing the monitoring. So the example you see on your screen is the Transparent Referendum Initiative, when it was the repeal the 8th abortion referendum in Ireland a few years ago, and they were monitoring what the no side, often funded by lots of cash coming out of America, were pumping out onto social media, trying to keep track of what they were saying. But obviously, there's some pretty horrible stuff being said, pretty graphic images being pushed by that side. So they had to set up a team of I had to set up a process of rotas and debriefs, and sometimes even sort of like semi-counseling with the volunteers who were doing this monitoring, so that they were making sure to look after them. I think that's a really important thing that you should be thinking about, even if your team is you just checking the notifications all the time. Do you have a system where your well-being is looked after if you're going to get potentially disturbing content or potentially abusive content leveled at you the whole time? There are, I should have actually found in advance, but maybe someone actually can share. There are sort of like some examples and resource of this kind of social media kind of welfare care. Okay, questions to ask yourself when you're diagnosing. So this, I would characterize this as the phase of like, you've seen something come up and you're trying to think about what or if you should do about this. Brilliant page. Yeah, maybe I'll try and find out if someone can dig it out while we're talking. That'd be amazing. The resource on by Kirsty. I think the guiding question for this diagnosis phase should be, will you make it better? And one way of thinking about whether you will make it better is questioning who is the audience? Who is the audience for the controversy, for some of the attacks that you're seeing, but also who is the audience that's important for you? Brilliant, thank you, Paige. The well-being guide is now, the link to that is now in the chat box. So this is a classic kind of like audience spectrum sort of thing to think about. Your choir, your base, your persuadables, and the opposition's base, and then the unreachable people, the kind of the opposition's choir. Some of the most common mistakes I see are people focusing on the unreachable just because they're the ones who are most like visceral against you, trying to worry about them when there's really often nothing you can do about them. Or on the other hand, because the choir are often our co-workers, our colleagues, our friends, who are within our social tribe, focusing most on them as our peers, as the audience. But it's also, I think sometimes people are a little bit like, oh no, I'm trying to reach the people in the middle. I'm trying to reach the genuinely persuadable swing voters, movable middle, whatever categorization you've heard for them. Whereas often you don't actually need to reach those people, or those are people who are not interested or are conflicted about the issue, and you'd be much better off trying to get your base, your potential supporters who are undermobilized, and to be able to reassure them or mobilize them to persuade other people instead. So that's one question I think is always helpful when diagnosing what you do about a controversy that you face. Another one would be, what's the proportionate use of your time and money? I always remember this example that I was told when interviewing someone from the Syria campaign, when they were facing Russian disinformation and attacks against the white helmets in Syria at a mass scale, is they always had to have an internal mantra as like, why are you spending like half an hour of every week responding to 15 different people who each have 5 followers each, and a lot of them might be bots even on social media, when you could be spending that time trying to get the next front cover of Time magazine. For our purposes, for our strategic objectives, that is way more valuable a use of time. Obviously, that's an extreme example. Not all of us are going to be going for the front cover of Time magazine, but think about what's your equivalent? What's the thing that's kind of like a little scratch that you're spending, or that you're spending lots of time dealing with individual scratches, when you could be thinking about what's the more important counterblow that's important to your strategy that you could use. And then another process tip, another boring internal process tip, but something that makes your life easier that I found in a couple of organizations, is to have some kind of either document or internal conversation on who responds to what kind of controversy, but not just a kind of like a restrictive policy, but with an emphasis on trusting people to make responses themselves with their judgment within clear guidelines, and then making it really clear when it is they need to escalate it. So the idea, not that sort of like, hey, unless you're the CEO of our organization, keep your mouth shut about any issue, but actually thinking, hey, our staff and our volunteers are often our most effective message carriers. Also there's more of us, more of them than there are of our CEO. So we should actually be explicit about what potentially controversial subjects we actually want to empower them to talk about when they're having conversations with people in services, online, in their own social circles, but make them feel safe by giving them a really clear delineation of, okay, this topic comes up, like how much does your CEO earn, or like what about this safeguarding thing that I heard about the other year? When that comes up, you should feel completely comfortable. Just say, hey, that's not my arena. I will flag that and escalate that to this person. And just having something like this and having this conversation internally can make everyone feel a little bit more reassured, but also actually empowered to go out and take on some of the controversies. So you've decided you do want to respond. These are some things that I've seen. Well, be honest, these are mistakes I've made and things to learn from them. So a lot of sort of like messaging devices that we've always got to be positive, we've always got to be proactive, we should be on the front foot. But we know that a lot of the time we're confronted with people who have more power than us, messaging that puts us in a dilemma about whether and how to react. And the kind of classic options for this are like either ignore it, fact check it, pivot away from it, or refute the people who are pushing disinformation or lies. And I'll just sort of go through my opinions on sort of like this advice. So you probably heard like the internet kind of saying of don't feed the trolls. It can be true in some cases, but I feel like it's mostly advice given to people and organizations who are being harassed by individuals or smaller organizations who are trying to get a rise out of them, trying to provoke a reaction out of them so they can piggyback on their platform. That's often where this advice, this kind of like well shared advice, comes from. Whereas I would say in most of our situations, or those situations with the activists I work with, the people who are pushing lies and hate about us and our issues don't actually care whether we feed them. They have huge political and media infrastructure to get their message out already. And ignoring them completely can sometimes just give up on the audiences the audiences that we need, who will only be left hearing the other side's lies. You know, we're not being given equal time in a debating society event. And that's one aspect of the kind of ignore temptation or ignore advice I'd seen. And another temptation I've seen is that organizations fall into, let's talk indirectly about the issue, but without mentioning the words or the kind of the hot phrases that the opposition have tried to make toxic. Like this word's become too problematic, or they've just put too much heat on this particular phrase, so let's not talk about it. But I would also advise that with some qualifications, this risks alienating our supporters, people who are passionate about issues like gender, or issues like decolonization. And it also doesn't move our persuadable audience away from the opposition, because they don't know what it is that we're talking about, because it's only the opposition that are left hammering away at it. I actually saw a group in Latvia had done some message testing where they were testing about comprehensive sexuality education, so sex and relationships education, and they were so careful to not say the word sex or sexuality because they'd worried that the opposition had successfully toxified those words, and just replacing that with care and well-being. That they found that actually the audience they were talking to didn't even know that they were actually talking about sex education. It's an extreme example, but I think this that's something that a trap that often people trying to shy away from talking about controversial words that the opposition have toxified fall into. Sorry. Another strong temptation is to fact check. The 3 examples I'm showing on screen are all versions of real messaging that people in our sector have used. Contrary to what the far right has said, I am not advocating grooming of children. Despite the anti-abortion movement's claims, this is not about the defense of life. The number of abortions does not decrease with the right to safe when the right to safe and legal abortion is banned. Trans children are not regretting their choice and detransitioning. Only, insert statistic here, have actually detransitioned. This is a transphobic narrative. So apart from some other issues with these responses, the main thing I'd say is like this kind of the compulsion to fact check or myth bust that you often see in content has a problem, especially when it's kind of giving the opposition's lie primacy. It's repeating their lie first, which when you think about how little attention span we've got to deal with, and how really only the first whatever percentage of your content people are actually paying attention to, it's kind of criminal to give away our prime real estate in our messaging to repeating their framing, repeating the framing that's damaging to us. What can you do instead? Advice that's often given is to pivot. I've seen sometimes the acronym ABC is used here. Acknowledge, so actually understand what's going on behind what's successful about the opposition lie or the myth. Bridge away from it, and then communicate your own priority framing. And another variety of response that I've seen, I'm just trying to give you sort of like templates for a response that sometimes cuts down on the mental load when you're drafting something, is if for strategic reasons, like thinking about your audience, thinking about the prioritization of your time and effort, it is necessary to address a lie head on. You can try to refute the liar without repeating the lie. And so two templates for how to do this are like the truth sandwich, which is where you talk about the truth, you note the attempt to divert attention, and then you come back to the real issues. It's not actually a sandwich because everyone knows a sandwich is the thing that's in the middle, but the point is that you're spending more time talking about the truth, and you give that primacy in your response. Or the kind of value villain vision framework, which is that you open with a shared value with the audience that you're talking about. You name the people who are spreading the lie, and you try and draw a smaller circle around them and a bigger circle about you and your intended audience as possible. And you ascribe motivation to why it is they're lying. So you don't repeat the lie that they're saying, but you point out why it is they're trying to do, why it is they're spreading this lie, because for political gain or to distract from from the real issue of the topic you're talking about. And this is sometimes controversial, but like I've seen enough evidence, and both in practice as well, that if you don't do this, the opposition is definitely doing it to you. And so ascribing motivation to the villain can actually help inoculate your audiences for future disinformation and future lies that they see about your organization and your cause. And then importantly, closing with some vision of what you're trying to work to and the fact that it's possible to win. Giving that hope and is really important as a way to close that out. So to be really simplistic, prescriptive, I would generally urge pivoting or refuting the liar rather than repeating the lie is a useful tactics if you do have to respond directly to some kind of misinformation. Just ignoring or kind of pure fact checking, myth busting, not so helpful from a messaging point of view. And then finally, just one tactic or one preparatory step that you could do is make some pre-written responses to potential controversies you can see coming up. I've seen this be really useful, done by the Syria campaign, who did a whole report which was basically doing that kind of ascribing motivation to the liars, where they pointed out how the Russian-led disinformation machine, including bots and paid influencers, was smearing Syrian humanitarians and human rights defenders. Separately, Mermaids knew that there was going to be lots of questions about the Tavistock clinic, and so they already got a kind of question and answer piece prepared. Now, the thing that I think is technically really clever about this, and also helps you, is that they've just created this resource once. And so whoever the social media team is not responding to every single troll that they get, trying to sort of like give them a clever rebuttal. They've just got this one response, and they can link to it over and over again whenever they get the classic lie or classic attack that they're facing on their platforms. And also, you're pulling them away from the platform, normally Twitter, but often other platforms, that is spreading the disinformation, and you're bringing them to your website where there's also more context, where there's also more information about the positive things that your organization is doing. And so for both those reasons, I think it's quite a clever tactic to do. Okay, so going through all those phases will often, and normally failing a couple of times, to be honest, and having a difficult experience trying to respond, is what will bring you back to preparation. And it will make you realize that there are some proactive things you can do to prepare for controversy. One would be proactive work with allies before controversy hits you. I think that there's lots of reasons for the differences between England and Scotland's situation on trans rights. But one, I think, is that Scottish feminists and Scottish trans groups did a lot of private work together before they got attacked, to think about, okay, first of all, to like just get to know each other and to actually hammer out some of the more difficult questions that should happen in private rather than in public. And then to agree, okay, when this happens, what's our position on this? What would be most useful? What would be being good allies to each other mean? And it meant that they were much more prepared on the comms side as well, with statements when they got attacked. This is an example of Scottish Women's Aid and their statement of solidarity here. And the other thing that I would recommend people do is to do some kind of scenario exercise. You might know that like private companies do something called wargaming or red teaming. Often it's more on like cybersecurity side. So they'll hire some teenage hacker to hack their servers and see whether they can manage it or not. And then they'll get told, did you respond to it well or not? but you can do your own scenario and you can make it fun. I've included a link to a Google Slides where I did this with a few activists a couple of years ago. But you can do your own sort of preparation, monitoring, diagnosis, response scenario, and doing it in a kind of safe environment with the team who would actually be responding to a controversy when it actually hits you, is a great way to then reflect at the end. Okay, where were our weaknesses at each stage of this scenario response? 2 weeks ago in Slovenia, we did this with a lot of LGBTI activists who are meeting together, and we made it kind of like a 1990s VHS board game style exercise where every 20 minutes there was an escalation to test whether their monitoring systems would actually catch it, and then to test whether they had whether they had really done a good risk register of what the impact would be, and then to force them to actually do a bit of a diagnosis and a response in the room right there. So that was actually really fun to do. Luckily, it was fun and not re-traumatizing. But doing some kind of exercise like this, ideally with someone external to come in to do it for you, but you can always use the template that I just shared in the previous slide, is a really helpful thing, I think, to do to stress test your response systems. Yeah, sorry, realizing about the time. So yeah, I'd love to hear that. This is just to show again those sort of five sort of like to-do items that are hopefully not crazily time intensive or out of reach for the kind of organizations that are in this session. I'll run through my plugs quickly then, so that we've got time just to hear about people, because I'd also be interested in people if like, oh yeah, I'm going to do that one, or I'm not sure if I could do that one. Other resources to check that I've been involved with: Blueprints for Change's Progressive Organizing and Campaigning Manual. I did a chapter on dealing with disinformation in there, where I interviewed some of those groups with those tips from Ireland and Syria. And my YouTube channel has videos about communications for activists in general. On this topic specifically, I definitely recommend looking at the one about conservatives and their communications failures, so that we don't think that there's some kind of all-powerful, omnipotent force. And also an analysis of pro-life, so an anti-abortion American group's internal messaging course, which I went on to see what it is that they're doing on their side to prepare for this. And there's a few tips we could learn from them. Okay, I intended to ask this question, but I realize we've only got 7 minutes left. So we could kind of throw it all in together. I'd be interested whether you have top takeaways or things that you'd like more of on this topic that you could type into the chat box. But I'd also just throw it open in general if people have questions. And I also I realize I might need to be time checked.
Thank you. As you put together your final thoughts into the chat, we at the PRCA would like to thank Sho Walker-Konno for this very thought-provoking, insightful session on preparing for controversy. So thank you, Sho, for sharing.
Great. Well, thanks so much, Sho and Nikki. I think that's the end of the session now. So yeah, once again, thanks for everyone for coming, and we'll be sharing all of the slides. And if you want to get in touch with Sho, I highly recommend it for any of this kind of work. So